Matt, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here because you have so much experience with being a CTO. You worked for several companies over the last 20 years in the role of the CTO. You have co-founded and exited some really cool companies. So I'm excited to dive deeper. But before we get into the nitties and gritties, I'm really wondering, what does it mean for you to be a CTO now after all these years being a CTO?
I mean, you're the guy that it's your head on the line if the software doesn't work, right? Like that's where it starts. Like if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. It all rolls uphill to the CTO, right? Is that the easiest way to describe it?
Yeah, well, probably. So you like the responsibility of it, right?
Well, I think to answer your question, I think there's a lot of different kinds of CTOs, right? So obviously, the CTO of a very large company like Microsoft or Google or some big company like that is totally different than the CTO of a very small startup. And then you've got lots of different variations of that in between, like a telecom like communications company or whatever might also have a CTO, but there might be like, how did we deliver our internet service or whatever. Like it's not software development related. And clearly there's companies that are SaaS companies, product companies that have probably a different kind of CTO than non-product companies, like different kinds of services or different industries or whatever. So I think the answer is it's all over the board, right? It's completely different from one company to another, and really what they need. I've spent my entire career basically working in startups. Like the first job I ever had as a software developer was a startup. So my whole world of that is totally tainted by the startup experience, including scaling. Like I've been in companies that have 300 employees as a CTO, but my experience is largely on the startup side, which is a different world than mid market to larger companies.
Awesome. And you also worked with different stakeholders in all of these companies, right? And the experience building the product is really important and priceless. So how do you go about engaging with these other stakeholders who are not technical? You need to get your message across, right? You need to build a great product. Those other people are not technical. You are technical. So how does it work usually?
It's very frustrating, right? I love my wife, but sometimes it's like trying to explain technology stuff to her feels the same way. It's like, come on. Um, I think the most people in this world don't really know how to build software. They don't even know how to use software, and they don't care, right? Like, I mean, even somebody like example of my wife, she's like, yeah, I watch, social media, do whatever. But when it comes to using like software, enterprise software, like she doesn't use any of that stuff on a daily basis. Doesn't care. She's not an expert at like what software looks like and how you would use software and what, the benefits are and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's true about most, all of our users, right? We build software for people, especially in B2B line of business, enterprise software, where they're like, hey, I work in a call center, I do this, I do that. I'm just trying to do my job and go home. I don't care about this software. And that's our average, our average user, right? Where as software developers, we feel like we're experts at building software because that's what we do all day. We're like, software should look like this, the field should look like this, the menu, the navigation, that, all the functionality, all the things. Like it to us, it seems like software should be easy to use, and we have a different kind of point of view on how software should work and etc. My point is, like, our average user doesn't. They have no idea. They don't care. They just want to do their job and go home. They don't care at all about software. And so I think that's one of the struggles we have. And then you talk to people that are in these line of business companies that a lot of times they're managers and stuff that you're talking to, right? These different stakeholders, they don't understand how to build software either.
Mhm.
And I think the value of a really good product team and CTO is being able to take all of that feedback, all of that input, and figure out like what do we really need to build? Like what should we actually do? And being able to say no, like being able to go back to some of these stakeholders and be like, no, this is a terrible idea. We're not going to build this thing because nobody's going to use it the way you want. There's actually a different way to use it. We're not going to save enough time. You can hire somebody manually to do this work for like nothing. Like there's a million different answers, but I feel like as a CTO and head of product, like you're always trying to bridge that divide and kind of safeguard like what are we actually investing our time in that we should be working on? Like what is strategic to the company? And I think that's one of the qualities of a really good CTO is they understand all of that. They think about this from a business perspective versus CTOs that are like, they're really software developers. They're not really business leaders. I think that's a big difference and a big gap that takes 10, 15 plus years of experience of building software, being around companies to be able to bridge that gap and have some of those conversations.
And it's very interesting that you say this because a lot of people are being promoted internally, especially in smaller companies, from software developers, tech leads to CTOs, and they don't really have the right knowledge to be a great CTO. So, often, the question also is, what does it really mean to be a great CTO? You mentioned the business understanding and the understanding of how to engage also with other stakeholders. So how can someone have the ability to understand if he or she is there or not yet? Because the role of the CTO, I mean, the title is the same, but you may not really be there just yet.
Well, I think it really depends on the company you're working for and what they need. And the job titles almost don't matter. Like the job title is really kind of irrelevant. And you think about this differently, imagine hiring like a head of marketing or a head of sales. Like what a head of marketing does or a head of sales does at a really small company or companies in different industries, right? Versus bigger companies is totally different. It's wildly different, right? Like running a sales team that, was selling stuff via direct mail and some other different ways versus running like a giant call center of salespeople or enterprise sales or whatever. Like they're totally different. And being a CTO is the same way. Like it very much depends on the type of business and the size of the business, right? Are you a generalist? Or are you a specialist? Are you more of an innovator? Are you more of a team lead? Right? Like, and you're not necessarily going to be all of these things. Very few people are going to be good at all these things. There's things that I'm really good at, and there's things I know I'm not good at. Myself personally, I'm really good at the innovating and building part of it. I spent most of my career as the CTO who was also the owner of the company, right? Which is very different. And part of that enabled me to have final decision and ownership on product. Like, how is this product going to work? Like, I own product. And I think that's where dev teams are the most successful, is when they have a CTO that really understands product vision and owns product vision, because you can move so much quicker, right? You're not sitting around in meetings with 10 people trying to get everybody to agree on what to do. If you've got a really smart CTO, or whatever the job title is, right? Like lead developer, tech lead, whatever the title is, right? Who's really good at product, that can cut through all of it, make the decisions, and everybody respects their decisions and they're able to execute. Like that's really where the value is. But CTOs in a lot of bigger companies, I feel like, are probably more like accountants.
Mm-hmm.
They're managing the budget. How much money do we spend on all these things? We had to buy, servers, we had to buy even equipment, and how much money we spend on all these vendors, all these things. Feels like it's like sometimes the job turns into being an accountant at a very high level, like just dealing with budgeting and all this kind of stuff, and is way less technical and way less product focused. And so I would hate that job. That would be terrible. I'd much rather be in a very small company where I can have ownership of the product, ownership of the technology, and be able to really drive that. And honestly, after doing this for 20 years, I don't really even want to be that involved in writing code anymore. I want to be involved in all the product decisions and the high level architecture. Like I want to make sure we're building things the right way, architecting things the right way, but not involved writing the code. And I think all of these things change, I think, as you, depending on the type of industry you work in and years of experience, right? If you have 5 or 10 years of experience, you're probably gonna have a different point of view and bring different value than somebody like me who's like, okay, I've done this for 25 years. It's a different ball game a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned something really interesting with regards to the ownership of the product, ownership of the technology. So if you were to interview a CTO to replace you, for example, like what are the things that you would be cautious about, and how would you go about interviewing the person to ensure that he or she has the ownership of the technology or can do it effectively? Like what are the, in other words, what are the aspects that you would focus on to ensure that this person is a great fit for the startup CTO role?
Well, I think in general, when it comes to building software, you've got people, It's varying levels of like how much direction do you have to give them, right? So if you hire like an entry level person, you got to give them a lot of direction, a lot of requirements, like very specific of like what to do, right? But if you have a more senior developer, you know, you can give them less direction. Like, we need to solve this problem, go figure out how to solve it, right? And the value of a really good CTO or tech lead is you don't have to tell them anything. They know all the questions to ask. You can parachute them in, they can look around and they can figure out, hey, how does that thing work? That thing looks like it's broken. We could do this a better way. I need to go talk to 3 people about this thing. I want to learn more. You don't have to tell them anything. They just figure it all out. And that is the key difference. If you can do that, you are a true technology leader. If you have to be told what to do, you're not really the technology leader. You're just like the sort of tech, dev lead, tech lead who's taken all the direction. The next level is being able to be parachuted in and just figure it all out. And there are a lot of people that do this every day that they wouldn't really probably consider themselves a CTO, but they're consultants. There's a lot of consultants that are really good at this, right? You can bring them in, you hire them, they assess everything you're doing, take note of it and help you identify, where you have weaknesses, things you can improve, all that kind of stuff. Those types of consultants are also the kinds of people that would be very good CTOs, right? And they're just the point is like they ask different questions, they see things in a different way, they don't need direction, they're able to figure out all the problems. And that would be me. You could drop me in anywhere, tell me nothing, and I will figure it all out. I will figure out everything. You don't have to tell me. And that is the next level. If you really want to be a good CTO, is being able to do that. Now, how do you find those people and interview them is kind of tricky, but like those are the types of qualities that I would be looking for. It's like, how could I bring somebody in and they can just figure it all out? They don't have to be told what to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, one interesting insight also for people who are listening to you right now could be, how do I know whether this is me, right? Because the perception and the reality could be different. People can, think about themselves that they are great self-starters and great leaders and whatnot, right? But if someone assesses them through some objective questionnaire or some assessment, they may get different feedback. So is there any kind of a question or some self-assessment questionnaire that comes to your mind, something that you would ask 2-3 people and you would be able to see who is a better fit for a technology startup, for example, as a CTO?
Well, the thing I would be wanting to look for is all the product. It's like all the product and business thinking, right? It's not about the code. It's about why are we doing this thing? How are we going to do it? And trying to identify if they're good at that, right? Being able to make those decisions around, should we do this thing? Should we do that thing? Why should we do it? Why shouldn't we do it? And dealing with that kind of ambiguity is hard. And dealing, as we mentioned earlier, with all the other stakeholders is hard, right? But that's the job. The job is being able to understand at a high level what, it's like the who, what, where, why, when, right? It's all those things. It's not writing the code. It's understanding like what code are we going to write? What problem are we going to solve, right? So it's that higher level part of it that as a CTO, you got to be really good at. So how do you identify that? I think it's, working through scenarios with them, problems, understanding, in previous jobs, different kinds of what their role was, challenges they had to deal with. But again, not challenges that were tech, not challenges that were like, well, I'll help save the company 10% by doing this thing on AWS. It's like, okay, fine. Why did you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Who decided to do that? Right? Like that's the higher level part of it you're trying to get to. And as a good CTO, they would be the ones that would be driving that, right? That are driving the higher level. It's not the fact that you saved the company 10%. It's like, why did you do that? And why didn't you do a bunch of other things that you could have did and decide to do that instead, right? Like that's the higher level thinking that you're trying to figure out if people can do.
Oh, this is actually really insightful, and I think a lot of people can relate to what you are saying now, because also in the previous episodes we were talking about how the business acumen and the understanding of the business world is really important. So have you seen some good examples of some courses or some books or some material that helps CTOs or technical leaders to actually learn this vocabulary, because it's completely different from what they are usually used to, right? It's not technical jargon anymore.
You know, I always say one of my favorite quotes is you can't learn to swim by reading a book. You
Good.
can't, right? You can't learn to swim by reading a book. You're just going to drown. You can read the book later and learn some pointers, right? Like, okay, I know how to swim now. Make me a better swimmer. And I think that the same is true for a lot of things in life, right? Unless you have done whatever the thing is and you have some experience with it, then you can go read these books and you're like, okay, I've picked up some pointers. I'm like, okay, now I can relate to these things, right? Before it's like I didn't understand the nuances or I couldn't relate to these things. I'm sure there are a lot of different resources out there. I had somebody on my podcast. I can't remember her first name, but her last name is Chalmers. Follow her on LinkedIn. She's absolutely fantastic around CTO kind of stuff. She's based in the UK, and I'm sure we can get the link and put it in your show notes.
Mhm.
I would definitely follow her on LinkedIn. She posts every week about what it means to be a CTO and all these different things. Like she's absolutely fantastic. I'm no doubt there's some resources out there. She's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. But more than anything, like if you want to become a CTO or you want to become a better CTO, the best way to do it is to start your own business. It's the only way you're really, really going to learn. I I did a survey once on LinkedIn about how did people become a CTO, and about 50% of them all answered that they started their own company. That's how they actually became a CTO. And the same with me. That's how I became a CTO, right? I started a company. And when I started the company, I was basically just a developer who had 3 years of experience. Who didn't know crap about what I was doing. And later, over a long period of time, became like a CTO, right? A lot of trial by fire and just learning on the job. And I think that's the way most of it's going to go. But you have to have the opportunity, right? You have to get yourself in a position where you can do these things, learn to do these things. And a lot of times it's going to be by starting your own company. It's much harder to do this, especially if you're in a larger company, because the larger a company you are, you become more and more of a specialist, right? Like in a super large company, everyone is a specialist. There's not a lot of generalists. And as a CTO, you become a really good CTO when you become a really, really good generalist, right? You have to be a really good generalist at all things related to tech, product, business. And you've got to be in a really small company to get that kind of experience. Is probably the key advice I tell people all the time. If you want the best experience in the world, you want to go work for the smallest company in the world, because you're going to get just exposure to all the different things, hands-on experience to all the different things. Or in a
Mm.
large company, you wouldn't get
Yeah.
experience to any of it.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. And this actually also reminds me that just a while ago you mentioned the different types or profiles of CTOs, the technologies and the visionary. And I'm also wondering, is there any way to communicate this somehow through LinkedIn or resume? Because if a recruiter or a headhunter reaches out to someone, the person may not be a good fit for that specific organization, right? But if there was a way to communicate this somehow, through some keywords or, I'm just kind of wondering if there is any way to communicate. Have you seen anything like this?
I think it just comes back to the rest of the sort of description of your career, or of yourself, right? Like on LinkedIn, if you put in your about me page, right, you'd be like, well, I love innovating, I love building products, I love working at startups, I like managing small teams or whatever, right? It would be
Mhm.
totally different than, oh, I worked at this company and managed an engineering team of 50 and blah 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 and whatever. Like you would clearly have like some kind of different background and experience. But maybe that's what you did and not what you want to do, right? You're like, I want to go do something different. But I think it would have to be that further explanation of that kind of just defines like where you feel comfortable, where you want to be.
Yeah, awesome. And now with all these AI advancements, I guess the job of the CTO is also a bit more challenging, isn't it? Have you seen some interesting examples of what does it really mean for a CTO to address some of these challenges?
I think it's a good question. So my day job, I'm the CEO of Full Scale. We do software development for other people. I have 300 employees in the Philippines that are almost like 280 of them are software developers. And AI is definitely a hot topic. And from my experience with our team of 280 or whatever, I think it's largely just a productivity tool, right? It's like it saves them a few minutes a day doing this thing or that thing. You see some industry stats that say it saves potentially 20% or 40% of your time. But most software development is spent reading code, trying to understand requirements, um, you know, troubleshooting things, debugging things, all these kinds of tasks. It's not always about writing code. So, I'm sure AI is going to continue to advance. And I've seen different things that help like even find bugs and, analyze errors and, software like stack traces and, all that kind of stuff to help find problems. And we'll continue to do that. But the thing that developers need to spend more and more time on and get better at isn't just the execution of writing the code, it's all the stuff that happens before that, right? It's the product part of this. Like, what are we trying to build? Like, why are we trying to do this thing? How are we going to solve the problem? How would we architect it? Thinking through all the requirements, all the stakeholders, all this kind of stuff, right? All the product kind of stuff before you get to actually writing the code. And I feel like developers are so focused on the writing the code part, but so much of the job and the value that they provide is all the other things, right? Like, people pay money to solve problems. They don't pay money to write code. And if we get to a future where AI writes most of the code, there's still all that other work that is really important to do. That is like 60 to 80% of the job is trying to figure out what code to write, like what problem to solve. So we'll see how things evolve over time if AI makes it easier and easier and easier to write the code. But I think the key to developers and CTOs and everyone else involved is realizing the bulk of the job to do is everything before that. It's like, what code are we going to write? How are we going to architect this thing? Right. And navigating all the stakeholders, getting everybody to agree, figuring out how are we going to release this thing? How are we, how are we going to put this thing in production? We got to convert this thing, integrate this thing. Like, there's all this different stuff that goes on, right? And all of that is the bulk of the work. And I don't see that changing. I think is the long answer to your question.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, I feel like AI has created more work at this point. We got more projects to do because we're trying to integrate AI with different things. I feel like it has just created more work. I'm sure we see a little bit of productivity gains, which is great. Some people again say that could be 20 to 40%, but so far it feels like it's created more work. And my point is, from a long-term perspective, maybe developers' work will shift a little bit, be less focused on the code and more focused on all the stuff that's actually more valuable that developers tend to spend less time on, which is all the product part of it that comes before you write the code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you mentioned, there are consultants who say that AI now helps to save 20 or 30 or 40% of the time. So like, have you really seen this gain to materialize, or do these people who get more productive, they start getting less productive because they spend more time getting a coffee, or like is it a real gain? In other words, like, is it something real that helped you save money or get more clients?
I don't think materially I could say, I can't objectively answer that and be like yes or no. My gut tells me it saves everybody 10 minutes a day on some rudimentary task. That's what it feels like to me. It's like,
Wow.
and that's where I've used it, right? It's like, for example, we need to do something to sort something for Google Ads, but I need to ignore if the first character was like a quote or a brace for like a list of keywords or whatever. It's like, okay, I could sit here and write some kind of algorithm to ignore the first character, or I could go ask ChatGPT and it gave me the answer in like 5 seconds, right? And so yeah, maybe that helps save an hour or two of like manually trying to figure out the little algorithm for the sorting thing. But the rest of the week may not have used it at all. So might have saved an hour, and that was the whole thing. So I think it's those little moments that are probably what most developers have, right? It's little bitty things like that is probably the biggest productivity gain right now. I think in a future world, will you be able to feed, your million lines of code into some AI model and it can do all this refactoring and do all this different things and whatever? In a perfect world one day, perhaps. But the problem is the developers are also going to have to would make a big shift for developers at being better and better at reading somebody else's code and debugging it, which developers hate and are terrible at, right? Like, if you wrote the code it's easy for you to understand what the code does and to debug it and troubleshoot it, versus if the AI writes all the code, but now you're trying to debug it because it doesn't work right, you may spend a lot more time trying to debug that somebody else's code that doesn't work quite right than if you just wrote it yourself. I think that's the trap, the kind of hidden trap in this. If you do something yourself, you understand how it works, you understand the logic. But if you're always taking code from somebody else, even if it's another human, it's so much harder to debug it. You're like, I don't know why he did it this way, and how to, I don't follow the logic the right way. And like you spend essentially hours trying to understand what does this code do and why does it do it this way. Versus if you wrote it yourself, you would understand. So I think that gap is always going to exist, and make it harder unless AI does all that magical troubleshooting for you as well. So
That's really interesting now when you say it, right? Because you manage those 290 employees, developers, so you know about their productivity and their outcomes. And it's really interesting, right? Like we were reading about this hype, how AI will replace engineers, and in reality, yet it doesn't seem to happen yet.
a lot of the news that I've read from Atlassian and some others that have, some of these bigger tech companies that have put out reports make it say like it's a lot of mixed results. Like there's a lot of hype, there are some benefits, but the benefits are not, they're not as good as like, Microsoft would put out some GitHub Copilot, thing like you're going to 80% this and 20% less bugs. And it all sounds like marketing BS, right? You're like, there's no way. And I think that's reality. Like when companies actually go do all this, they come back later and they're like, I don't know, it helped, but it wasn't like some magical thing. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, in reality, you would get 20% more projects done with the same amount of people. So maybe next year we will see.
We'll see.
And on this note, what other challenges do you expect, and what would you like other CTOs to consider also with regards to the new trends and innovation or potential hypes?
Well, I think in general, it's never been easier to build software. When I started doing this 25 years ago, I was building SaaS like 25 years ago before SaaS was even a term, right? Like they credit like Salesforce as being one of the first SaaS companies. I was building SaaS software in like 2000, 2001, 2002. Been doing this for a long time. So it's like way before the cloud existed, right? Way before AWS and Azure and all these things. Like if I wanted a server, I was racking it and eventually was installing VMware and installing a SAN and hypervisors, all this kind of crap. That was awful. It was terrible. I would never want to do any of that again. And I think we all don't appreciate how easy it is to build software now. Because of Azure and AWS, it's like I can, containerize my app and just ship this container and tell Azure, AWS to auto scale it and do all these things that were so hard to do 15, 20 years ago that are just like easy now. Same thing with all the platform as a service stuff. Like we are so lucky to do this now. Like back then, if I wanted to use like Memcache, before the days of Redis, it's like, well, let's figure out how do I install this thing? How do I support it? How do I set up high availability? How do I do all these things, right? Versus now you log into AWS and you're like, turn Redis on, boop, use it, boop, done, right? Like the world of building software is so much easier in so many different ways, especially like all the DevOps stuff. I feel like, I hate to say DevOps is dead, but it's like, the last app I deployed to Azure, and it was like click, 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 select GitHub repo, click, click, done. Like deployment pipeline is done. Like so much of this stuff is so much easier than it ever was. But back to part of our earlier conversation, the harder part is, what are we going to build? That is still the hard part. Like what software are we going to build? Deploying it, building it, all that kind of stuff is so much easier these days. And interestingly enough, the programming languages and frameworks, like the change in those has dramatically slowed down. Like over the last 10 years, people are still using React, like people are still using Angular and Vue and these different things that have now been around for like a decade. So it'd be interesting to see, do all the programming languages and frameworks sort of start to normalize? It's like the stuff's been around for a long time. It's tried and true versus, my career, when I started out, there was rapid amounts of change, right? Like I started out when there was Internet Explorer 6 and Netscape Navigator, and a lot of stuff was desktop apps and mobile didn't even exist. Like I've been, lived through so much of the changes of all this. And now it just like seems easy. It's like everybody's got it easy now compared to what I had to deal with.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I remember 10, 12 years ago, every Monday there was a new JavaScript framework.
Yeah.
Yeah, gone are those days.
Yeah. They've all been created now, it feels like.
Awesome. So then, the business acumen is quite important based on what you say, identifying what to do, what kind of application to build, engaging with other stakeholders as we discussed. Are there some other important aspects of the role that we overlooked? Something that you would like other CTOs to consider as well?
Well, so I thought about writing a book and doing a whole podcast series about this called the CTO Dilemmas. Because I feel like as a CTO, that's mostly what you deal with. You're dealing with like, how much security should we implement? How much risk should we take? Like, how fast should we ship code? Right? Like, should we use this cloud provider or this cloud provider? Like, you mostly are dealing with dilemmas where it's like there's not one clear answer. You have two options and maybe both of them are bad options, and you're always trying to pick between like the two options that seem bad is what it feels like, right? And I think as a CTO, like that ends up being the job. Like you end up having to make those hard decisions and dealing with a lot of those dilemmas at a high level, where at a lower level, if you're a team lead or architect or whatever, you don't have to make those as many of those really hard decisions that that roll up to a CTO, where you're making these really hard, kind of tough dilemma decisions. And I think that's one of the biggest differences is having the experience, the acumen, and the ability to make those decisions and deal with having to make those decisions. And some people can't deal with that. They're like, hey, just tell me what code to write and I'm going to go write this, build this awesome app. But as CTO, you end up dealing with all these other like weird, hard problems that are not just writing code all day.
Yeah, awesome. And you also mentioned that you are writing a book or about to write a book, if I recall, before we started.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about writing a book called Product Driven or Product Driven Development. We talked about this a little earlier. I feel like most developers, they're too close to the code and they're too far away from the problem and the product. And that relates not only to software developers, but also relates to CTOs, startup founders. Like there's so many things that you got to focus on the product and getting the product to market, what people actually want, what people actually pay for. Like that whole line of thinking is different than if you're like, oh, let's just go build cool stuff.
Yeah.
Like that's these things are at war against each other if you're trying to build a business. Focusing on the product and the business perspective. And I think there's a big gap in the knowledge and experience for most technology professionals, be it just software developers or even, managers, architects, CTOs, all this, missing the kind of product and business focus on it. And I've been considering writing a book that kind of talks about that gap.
Awesome. So it's a pity we cannot include the link in the show notes just yet, but
maybe one day.
Maybe one day, but at least we can include a link to your LinkedIn profile or some other website that you would like to promote.
Yeah, definitely follow me on LinkedIn. I have about 50,000 followers on LinkedIn. I post every day about a lot about startup and business stuff, but also CTO kind of related stuff. I also have my own podcast called Startup Hustle and a newsletter. You can subscribe to my weekly newsletter at startuphustlenews.com. And then my company, Full Scale, if anybody's looking to hire software developers, can consider us. That's what we do. We help other people build their teams. We provide the talent. Our employees are actually all in the Philippines.
Awesome. Well, I'll include these links in the show notes and on YouTube in the comment section. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining. It was very useful. Thanks for all these insights, and yeah, I hope to see you soon again.
All right, thank you so much.